Thank you for that very kind introduction, Michael. I try to get people not to call it the Spain train. With our educational levels, some people are wondering how do we get a train from Baton Rouge to the country of Spain. We've got enough issues without that. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. Linda Lightfoot and I were in a meeting, and she turned to me and said, "Would you come speak?" And I said, "I'd be delighted." So thank you for the kind invitation, Linda. And I see lots of, right down there in front, trying to hide. Lots of friends here. I have the great privilege, as Michael told you, for working for the Baton Rouge Area Foundation. I want to acknowledge some of our people who are in the room. Would you all stand up and just let people know that I'm not doing all this work and you are? Stand up if you work for the Baton Rouge Area Foundation or have. Okay, don't. The foundation is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. It has more than $700 million in assets, which makes it one of the largest community foundations in the country. Our foundation and its donors give roughly $50 million away to various organizations and projects each year. You wake up every day, you go to work, as we all do. But for the 20-plus years I've been at the foundation, I have mentally made a statement to myself when I pressed the button to go home on that elevator. And I said, thank God for the privilege of working for an organization that made an impact in somebody's life today. And it doesn't get any better than that. And so it doesn't happen without our donors, our partners, people who work with us on all of these projects. And so thank you for being a part of what we all collectively are doing each day to try to make our community a better place. I'm privileged to talk about two of my favorite projects today. If you were young, did you ever get, raise your hand if you got a model train for Christmas? Okay. I'm admitting to this group publicly, I'm a train geek, okay? I had trains. I love trains. I still have trains. But I started looking at the idea of post-Katrina, what are the lessons learned? And all of us know there are hundreds and hundreds of lessons of what we could do better. What could we change? How could we prepare ourselves? God forbid if we ever have to live with that issue again. And one of the issues that I want to talk about is the use of these trains in those disasters that we hope never happen. But let me give you some background on a slide that I just realized is very, very hard for you to read. But I want to give you some background about Louisiana and trains. And this is a map from the Department of Transportation that talks about trains in Louisiana. And you'll see these are freight trains, and you'll talk about the various lines there. Some of those you have waited in your car for minutes, if not hours, for trains to pass on. But you'll also look down in the principal commodities. It won't surprise you to see that they are critical in carrying the chemicals, the petrochemicals, all of that manufacturing that we do in Louisiana and share it with the world. And so trains are a very, very important part of our economy. Up until the late 1960s, 70s, people forget this, but freight railroads ran passenger trains. When you watch those black and white films, those old westerns where they pull that train in, that passenger train was run by the freight railroads. A couple of things happened. In the late 1960s, we did a couple of things. We invented the interstate highway system, and we invented a jet engine. And what did Americans do? They started driving. Every TV ad said, go buy that new Chevrolet, have the roof down, and you can drive and see America. And we did. And we started having airline service. And over the next few decades, airlines came to every city, large, medium, small. And we quit riding passenger trains. What we didn't know, really didn't appreciate, was it was a regulated industry, which meant the freight railroads could not get out of the passenger business without Congress saying, you can. But they were going broke. They went to Congress and said, please let us out of the passenger business. Congress ultimately, the federal government said, okay, we'll do that. But it's pretty obvious that we're going to have passenger service of some kind. And they invented Amtrak. And the second decision they made was, it's even more obvious that we cannot overnight build rails that carry just passengers. You're going to have access to the freight railroads. And so in order to get out of the passenger business, the freight railroads made a deal that said they will share their tracks with the new passenger service called Amtrak. So Amtrak in this country runs on freight rails. They pay the freight operators for the use of those rails. And what is important about those decisions is that if you have the privilege of traveling to Europe or Asia, you realize that passenger rail is dramatically different. You're riding on trains that are running at 200 miles per hour or more in China today. They do that because they're on dedicated rails. They aren't sharing them with freight operators, and it's two separate systems. But if you imagine the cost of our today going back and having to build a separate rail network for just passenger rail, it would be cost prohibitive. But it happens in a few places. The Northeast Corridor, we run an Amtrak Acela train at 150 miles an hour or so, and it serves Boston, New York, Washington, the corridor, and it's a critical part of their economy, and it's never really been replicated anywhere else in the country. Fast forward. Here's the Louisiana Passenger Rail Network. What you're seeing, and some of you, how many of you have ridden on Amtrak? Oh, I'm speaking to my friends. I ride trains, and I ride trains and tell myself that I'm doing it for business, but I really love riding trains. So what you're seeing there are three major rail lines serving the city of New Orleans. The one that runs along the coast is the Sunset Limited. It's a train that ran from Los Angeles to Jacksonville. And I say ran because in 2005, Hurricane Katrina wiped out all the freight lines along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And the Sunset Limited no longer went east of New Orleans. They wanted to start it back, and an organization called the Southern Rail Commission said, please don't. Southern Rail was created in 1982 by the Congress of the United States to promote passenger rail service in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and each governor appoints 6 commissioners. I've been privileged to serve on the Southern Rail Commission for more than 10 years. And I'm privileged that multiple governors have seen some wisdom in allowing me to continue doing that. I remember the lunch with Governor Jindal in the mansion, who was not crazy about trains, and said, I'll appoint you if you don't embarrass me. And I promised that I wouldn't, and I think I lived up to that. The second line you see is the city of New Orleans. And if you've ridden on I-10 to New Orleans, you see a beautiful rail bridge that's been built over the last few years on to your right, and that is the city of New Orleans taking you to Chicago. If you want to go spend a nice weekend, take the city of New Orleans to Chicago. It's a wonderful experience. The last one you see is the Crescent. The Crescent moves out through Slidell, goes ultimately to Atlanta and Washington. And a good part of the legislature last year rode that train to go to the Washington Mardi Gras and experienced it for the first time. Notice there's no passenger line to the Capitol. Okay. We've been working on this for some time. And the good news is that there are ongoing conversations about additional train services that Louisiana can use. Baton Rouge to New Orleans is what we'll spend time talking about today. And the sponsor of that project is Louisiana DOTD. It's a state-supported route. What that means is that if a service is more than 750 miles long, the track's more than 750 miles long, it's a long-distance train, and Amtrak operates it. Anything short of that is a state-supported train, meaning the state will subsidize the operating cost of that service. And almost without exception, there are states that contract for Amtrak to do it, but they are run under a contract of the state. That's what we'll be doing on the Baton Rouge to New Orleans. You see the next one there is the Kansas City Southern, Canadian Pacific Kansas City Southern line. One of the issues that's taken so long is that the freight railroad, Kansas City Southern, that owns that track, is the only one of the Class 1 freight railroads that never had passenger service. And they really didn't want John Spain and other people talking about putting passenger trains on their tracks. And they really did kind of fight that. The good news is what you see in front of that is Canadian Pacific that took over Kansas City Southern in the last year and a half or so. Canadian Pacific is Amtrak's #1 partner. So we've gone from someone who legitimately had reasons not to do it to someone that does business every day with Amtrak. And we now have a freight operator as the partner on that proposed route. Gulf Coast Corridor, New Orleans to Mobile. Remember that sunset train that was going from Los Angeles to Jacksonville? And we said, please don't do that. The reason we said it, it got to New Orleans late. And so you would be catching a train at 2 a.m. in the morning to go further to Jacksonville. And no one rode it. And we said, let's just stop and let's start a train in New Orleans. That way we can control when it leaves, make it attractive for people to use. And that's what Amtrak has done. So in September, we believe, there will be a train set in Mobile, a train set in New Orleans. They'll leave in the morning and come back in the afternoon. That gives us 4 passes across the Gulf Coast into New Orleans. That is the restoration of passenger service east of New Orleans, which we ultimately will push to have extended either back to Jacksonville or maybe Orlando. But it is a quality control issue because we will say when the train leaves in order to have people use it at an appropriate time. The I-20 corridor is really interesting. One, it's North Louisiana, and that's interesting to all of us in the south part of the state. I get in trouble because my wife's from Shreveport when I tell those jokes, so I have to be careful about it. But that's basically Dallas to Atlanta, okay? Amtrak wants to do it. And what Amtrak said a year or so ago is that it would like to take the Crescent, that train that we saw go to New Orleans, split it at Meridian, Mississippi, go across the I-20, give rail service to Monroe, Ruston, Shreveport, and then to DFW. And the good news about that is that the rail tracks were actually updated a few years ago by the freight operators. They're in good shape. And because, remember, you said it's more than 750 miles, it means it's not a state-operated train. It's part of the long-distance Amtrak route, which means Amtrak pays for the operating cost. So that one is very easy to do, and don't be surprised if that doesn't happen fairly quickly. So let's talk about Baton Rouge, New Orleans. I believe every day that I go to New Orleans that I can be there in about an hour, maybe a little more, okay? Now the truth is we can get to the airport in maybe an hour. And depending on the day and the time of day, it could be another 45 minutes to an hour to get downtown, okay? So here's the good news. Why would you ride a train? How many of you would ride the train if it was here today? Man, I'd take a picture and send it to Amtrak. I got believers here, and I've got 200 slides, folks, so hang in there. Okay, it's an 80-mile route, okay? You see what it says there? An hour, hour and 15 minutes or better. Now you're going from downtown Baton Rouge to downtown New Orleans in an hour, hour and 15 minutes, okay? You've got a state-supported train. The contract will be with Amtrak. And you've got the host railroad, Canadian Pacific, as I just said, saying, yeah, we'll do that, okay? Here are the stations. Baton Rouge downtown, Government Street at 14th. Some of you that have white hair like me remember the old train station was there, and we're going back there. You know what the good news is that a guy named Joe Biden is president. Now, if you're a train guy, you know that Joe is called Amtrak Joe. Did you know that? Tragedy occurred in the president's life where his first wife and child were killed in an accident. And as a member of Congress, he made a pledge to his new wife and his remaining children that he would come home every night. And he left the Capitol, got on an Amtrak train, and rode it back to Delaware each and every day. And obviously the crews from Amtrak became very familiar with this member of Congress and gave him a nickname called Amtrak Joe. I had lunch with the vice president in 2017, and you may recall that at the time he had offered Governor General Obama, and he had offered Governor General $300 million for this train. So in 2017, we're having lunch, and he says, you know, if y'all had taken that money, we'd be riding that train today. Well, we didn't take the money. We're not riding that train, but he's now president. And we said, okay, Amtrak Joe, do you remember us? And we've had communications with the administration saying, yes, he's still very much interested and is familiar with this route and would love to see us happen. And so what Joe's done now is set aside $60 billion for inner-city rail projects, which means this is one of those rare times where money's really not the issue. The money is there, okay? So the Baton Rouge station's downtown. There's probably going to be a second station in the south part of the parish for a couple of reasons. It's fast growing. I don't know that you heard, but we have a new city down there. It gives access to Ascension Parish. More importantly, when it comes to evacuating our friends in New Orleans, God forbid that we have to do that, the first people out are probably going to be people in hospitals. And these become evacuation trains. And what we want to do is move them out of the New Orleans hospitals into the Baton Rouge hospitals, which is why we want to have a station in the health district. And we are working on federal grants that would look at the technology involved, so if you are being monitored in a New Orleans hospital, we can let you continually be monitored as you're moved from a hospital to a train all the way up, handed off to physicians in our hospitals so that we can care for you in those disaster areas and know that you're being taken care of. So the technology is something we're going to look at, but that's going to be the second station. There are people in the city that think we need one in North Baton Rouge, and that's a conversation that continue to take place. But the mayor has $15 million for the downtown Government Street station. The grant is awarded. We just got to get the state to sign the contract to start the train. Gonzales has a federal grant for a $5 million station. Laplace will be a station. New Orleans International Airport has been our partner in this conversation since day one. They also have applied for federal money. The idea simply is that if you want to fly out of Louis Armstrong, and close to 50% of you do, you will take this train. It will stop at a stop at Louis Armstrong. You will step off a train. You'll probably get on a shuttle bus initially, but Louis Armstrong is planning for a light rail, and you'd step on that light rail, take you into the terminal. It's called multimodal. We all say, wow, wouldn't that be nice? It only happens 1 million times every day around the world. We're just a little bit behind on that. But they are a part of this conversation, and so you'll have a direct multimodal connection to New Orleans International Airport, and the cost of the train will probably be less than one night's parking. How much do we think it will cost? We don't know yet, but the early estimates are about $15 each way. Okay? Now, don't hold me to that because it may change, but those are the rough estimates. Then you'll have a one stop in Jefferson Parish, and then you'll ultimately end up in New Orleans. Initial frequency is we'll start 1 trip daily, and then in 2 trips daily in about 6 months. Now everybody looks at that and says, woo. What we know is frequency is going to be the key. You're not going to get off an airplane and sit for 2 hours waiting on a train. So over time, you have to have the frequency so that you can make that true multimodal connection, get off a plane in a reasonable amount of time, get on a train and go. And we all know that. It just takes time to start the service and get it done. We have studied this thing. That won't surprise you. But we studied it starting back in 2008. We started it again in 2014. We're studying it again in 2017. And we have a feasibility study going on in September of 2023. You may remember in the closing weeks of John Bell Edwards' administration, he was a big supporter of this project, and he actually had Amtrak come to New Orleans and do what's called an inspection train, where they bring an empty train in. They had a press conference. They announced that the state of Louisiana wanted to enter into a memorandum of understanding with Amtrak to run train service. Amtrak signed it. The governor signed it. We rode on a train to New Orleans, had another press conference in Baton Rouge. It was a lovely day for people like me, okay? It was a geeky day, okay. But what was not signed was the operating agreement. So let's sum up where we are on this. Federal money is there. All of the real work has been done through the last governors. Where we are now is the state needs to finalize the proposal and meet with Amtrak and say, we would like for you to run a train for us under a contract. If we sign that today, this train service probably could start in 2 years. The Bonnie Carey Spillway, remember that beautiful bridge that we talked about going to Chicago? We're not using that track. We're using one you don't see, which is further in, paralleling Airline Highway, which means we have to replace an old wooden trestle at Bonnie Carey. Again, the money's there, but that will take 18 to 24 months to replace it once you get the commitment to start. Amtrak, everybody agrees, we can run it on that track, and that when we get to that place, we just slow it down from 90 miles an hour to 10 miles per hour. And you're slowing down for Louis Armstrong anyway. So they could start it, and they admit that. But that's where we are. And obviously, we have a new administration. We have to bring them up to speed. We have to make sure the governor understands what we're trying to do. We've started those conversations. DOTD is working on the final numbers that can be presented to the new administration. So progress is continuing, and the transition from one governor's candidate to the next is taking place. I-20, there you see the citizens, the cities it serves. It's going to be very important. If you're trying to get to DFW, why drive if you can take a train, right? Ultimately, what's going to happen here, folks, is that assuming we're successful, that Baton Rouge to New Orleans train will continue going to Baton Rouge, New Orleans, but we'll extend the train service to Shreveport. And for the first time, we'll be able to connect North and South Louisiana, which will be very, very important. It will bring those northern legislators to Baton Rouge quicker. Okay, that's trains. I'm going to try to wrap up where if you have questions, we can come back to them. You got a question, I'll take it right now.
Yeah. So you have the privilege of getting New Orleans and Baton Rouge together and the stuff.
Yes.
I was in the Chamber of Commerce in New Orleans. Moved up here with the Baton Rouge Chamber, and that was my part of the. And we tried to talk to New Orleans, and I'm from New Orleans, and I know how they are, and they still the same way. And so we tried many, many times to get to New Orleans, and they said we're not going to do it. And I continue to do it. I know where we work for years.
Well, that's very kind. One of the things that happened was something that had to be created to get past the issue of the historical differences between New Orleans and Baton Rouge and the competition that existed, and we created something called the Super Regional Rail Authority. It's created by the state of Louisiana with 4 people from each parish between Orleans and East Baton Rouge with the authority to do construction projects. And that group, which frankly hasn't met in a year, but what was more important was in the early years, it brought the people together. And they started a conversation. And post-Katrina, our friends in New Orleans understand, we took them in. It wasn't ugly. It wasn't well planned. This is one of those things, as I spoke of, that could facilitate those evacuations. We are linked whether we like it or not. More importantly, we are the state's largest economies. We drive the future of this state together. And if we don't work together, not just on rail, but on water issues, on coastal issues, we're doing harm to the state and our grandchildren. So the conversations we've had is, frankly, the leadership in New Orleans, particularly GNO, Ganoff, the foundation, airport, and Mayor Cantrell, who I've met with several times, says, we're absolutely going to do our part. So everybody's on board. Now we'll see, but that's where we are. And I'm pleased to tell you that the parish presidents along the route have all said, we want to be a part of it. Okay, we're going to change subjects. Other questions on rail? I can tell Amtrak that the first couple of trains are sold.
I'm curious about the ridership, projected ridership, because I assume that has to help finance the long-term viability.
Federal government understands that. Studies that were done said roughly there's about 1,000 people that live in the greater New Orleans area that drive to Baton Rouge to work each day. There's about 1,000 people from Baton Rouge that go the other way. Now think about the impact if we just take those people off the interstate. They're those people anyway, but they ride a train. What we know is that there are places where companies buy tickets for those employees to ride trains, okay? Think about the idea that we've looked at inner city unemployment, people who would like to go to work but don't have a car. And think about a train that could take them from the inner cities of New Orleans and Baton Rouge to a central place inside the petrochemical corridor. They get off, a bus takes them to work, brings them back, and they go home at night. This train will carry people for a lot of different reasons. Think about college students who are coming from elsewhere and going to Louisiana Tech. We're connecting people, states, because we need to have the ability to bring people to places who don't have automobiles and don't have the wherewithal to do it. Think about transferring people, as I said a moment ago, from hospitals. This is a better way of doing it. Did I answer your question? Well, ask me again.
The question really is, how many people need to ride the train in order to make it viable? And
Okay.
how are you going to
No.
market it?
Okay, so here it is. Remember that 60 billion? All right, the federal government understands that nobody's going to fill a train on day one. There's an R&E grant, okay? What the R&E grants is a 6-year plan. And it says when you're ready to start, state of Louisiana, the federal government will subsidize the operating cost in year 1. We'll pay for 90%. In year 2, 80%. Year 3, 70, 60, 50, 40. It's a 6-year subsidy because the government knows that you're not going to have ridership that can help you financially run this train. So they give you a federal subsidy over that 6-year period that lets you start growing ridership so it financially makes sense. We believe, rough numbers are, the operating cost to the state of Louisiana for this train is around $10 million a year. It's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money when you start thinking about this. And if you think about that R&E grant, assuming that the state applies and gets it, then the amount of money actually being spent in those first 6 years is relatively a small number connecting the state's 2 largest economies. It's got climate change impact, it's got traffic impact, it's got the ability to bring people to work impact. So if the numbers are what we believe they will be and the federal subsidies are there and we can win those, then financially it makes a lot of sense. Another question. Yes, sir.
So 60 billion is the number that's allocated, correct?
Yeah, we're not getting all of it.
Okay. Well, I asked because, playing devil's advocate, California ended up spending a whole lot more money than they thought they would, number one, and then number two, politics got in the way of doing the project in the most expeditious way possible. How do we prevent that from happening?
Because we're not doing what California does. What California said was, we're not going to use Amtrak, we're going to build our own high-speed train, a 200-mile-per-hour train based on the European model. Think about how much land is vacant in the state of California. You got to go in and buy the right-of-way, and you've got to tear people's houses down, and you've got to run across somebody's farm. Remember, we are using existing tracks, so we're not doing that. Brightline is a company that started private rail in Florida and is now building a high-speed train from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. I rode on their train from West Palm Beach to Miami a year or so ago. So a lady sitting across the aisle from me on a laptop. I introduced myself and asked her why she's on the train. And she smiles and she says, I'm an attorney and I'm going to see my client in Miami. And she smiles and she says, the train's got Wi-Fi. I can eat, drink, get up and go to the restroom, and I can bill for my 2 hours down, bill for my 2 hours back, and bill for my time with a client. She said, if I'm driving on the car, I'm not getting paid. I can't guarantee that I'll be there on time if the truck's back up or there's a wreck. And so it was predictable and it was productive. That's what we have to remember. We're used to being in our cars where we really aren't supposed to be doing some of the things we do as we work in our cars. But that always struck me as a really good example of how you can be productive and have a predictable on-time arrival, turn around and go back. Think about that same trip had she driven it down and had to drive it back at the end of the day, and she couldn't have been billing her clients. It was a productive day. The lakes. Go ahead, trains.
Is there one set of tracks or 2 sets of tracks going each way from New Orleans to Baton Rouge?
There are multiple sets of tracks. We're only going to use one.
So you can't take a train from Baton Rouge to New Orleans in the morning and a train from New Orleans to Baton Rouge in the morning?
Yes, you
for those
can.
1,000 people?
Oh, yeah, no, there'll be sidings. Yeah.
So
No.
we'll have access to two
Yeah,
trains running the route, okay.
Yeah, I mean, what's also a part of the agreement is that people are more important than freight, okay? Remember, we're sharing those tracks. That means that we're gonna build sidings, and that freight train pulls over, and the passenger train goes by. That's not imaginary. Remember, Amtrak is on freight tracks throughout the country. It happens all the time. When we share a rail, there are sidings at appropriate places where the freight train gets out of the way for the faster-moving passenger train. Ultimately, in this country, we hope that we'll build separate lines, but we've got to start somewhere.
7 minutes left.
Pardon me?
7 minutes left.
7 minutes, and then we'll talk about the lakes. Here we go. All right. 1933. There's some property owners that say they're going to donate some land to LSU, and the deal is, yes, we're going to give it to you, but only if you promise that you're going to build lakes. And they did. And the lakes were basically, if you look at the posters out front, you'll see the lakes are basically cypress swamps. LSU moved to the new campus about 7 years before they started looking at the lakes. So in the 1930s, 2930s, they sent people in with saws and started cutting down the trees and turned those cypress lake swamps into lakes. We stopped maybe a malaria outbreak and who knows what else, alligators and everything else. And so these are recent pictures. And here's those lakes in modern time covered with silt and starting to die, which brought us to the Baton Rouge Area Foundation's attention. You could walk across most of these lakes who were on average 2 feet deep. Most people will tell you they think they've silted in. That's a small part of it. What they've actually done is a process called flocculation. And what that means is because the lakes are so shallow, sunlight penetrates to the bottom, grass grows. Grass dies, that process repeats itself. And so internally, because they are so shallow, they are creating silt inside. How much silt? They told us two things. Enough silt for bumper to bumper dump trucks from Baton Rouge to Little Rock, Arkansas to carry the silt off. Or if you don't like that example, you can fill Tiger Stadium with the soil we're talking about and it's over pouring. It's just pouring out of Tiger Stadium. We said we can't afford to do either one of those, which means most of the dirt stays in the lake. We can't afford to haul it off. That's good because we can start rebuilding parts of those barriers that have been eroded and washed away. And so what we're talking about ultimately is about a $74 million project. Now, who owns the lakes? Well, let me ask you, how many lakes are there? Oh, this is my favorite question because people say 2, then they say 4. Somebody just added some that aren't there. There's 6 lakes. Who owns them?
LSU, city.
City owns 2. This isn't hard. Which one do you think the city owns? Oh, good. Good. We're on a good start here. You're right. It also owns a second lake called Erie that none of you know anything about and don't know where it is. Do you know where it is? Okay. Just on the other side of City Park, if you're riding around Lake Shore, there's a horseshoe little road and there's a lake there. It's almost totally gone. Okay? So the city owns 2. Who owns the other 2? LSU, meaning the state of Louisiana. So LSU owns 4 lakes, okay? We created BREC back in 1948. Some of this stuff was going on, and ultimately the city entered into an agreement with BREC to operate and be a part of the lakes, which is why they've come into this conversation. So they've contributed money, they're a major part of it, and ultimately the goal is to create these lakes where they are first and foremost healthy. Second, safe, because they were never designed or built to deal with the number of people that are using them every day. You drive around the lakes on any given day, and chances are you're going to come around one of those corners and somebody's jogging in the middle of the street, or a mom is pushing a baby stroller. Why? There aren't any sidewalks. So what will happen is that we will take that soil and we will build new land between the road and the water edge wide enough to build sidewalks and bike paths. to make them safe. Here's the other thing. Who can tell me what's in that picture that's not real?
Bridge.
A bridge. Interstate's on the top of that. That's a picture of the new May Street. And we will, for the first time, connect City Park and University Lakes. You want to hear a John Spain idea that was a terrible one? We said, look, all those Ivy League schools have crew racing. What happens when it's in the middle of winter and all their water bodies freeze? We could invite them down here. We could have a party right there, and we could watch crew racing start on Stanford coming across University Lake, underneath that bridge into City Park. Wouldn't that be cool? They weren't interested. But we will build a bridge, and that connects them. That makes it healthy. It does make it, usable from a recreation standpoint. And on the north end up there, at City Park, Breck and Corey's here. Tell me when I'm speaking out of school, because I'm spending your money, Corey, with Breck. But the intent is to have a place where you could rent a canoe or kayak and for the first time actually get out on the lake. And so when it's healthy, we want people to be able to use it, and we want them to be able to go the length of both lakes. There you see the sidewalk. That's the road on the right. You see the sidewalk that's going to be built on new land that doesn't exist today. LSU is on the left side of that picture. You see Knock Knock. Knock Knock was built after we started planning this, and part of the conversations we're having with them is how do we have kids and parents go from Knock Knock to the lakes, because we want kids to learn how to fish. We want to build a pier where they can fish. We want kids who are in wheelchairs to be able to go down to them, lock them onto that pier in that wheelchair, and teach them how to fish. We want it to be accessible, but it has to be safe. So the state is looking at a roundabout at that intersection where you go up to the interstate. And we're starting to talk about, with Knock Knock in the state, how do we make the lake accessible to families and kids coming from Knock Knock? So that's part of the ongoing part of the idea. This is a sidewalk that doesn't exist, but you can kind of see it is planted. It will have beautiful trees, plants, gardens as you walk around it. There's the bridge again. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but here's where we basically are. Patrick Martin is here from LSU's foundation. One of the things we decided early on is we brought everybody together, we did the master plan. What we said was, we have the city parish, we have Breck, we have the state of Louisiana, we have LSU. The Baton Rouge Area Foundation should not be doing the contracts on public projects. So we asked among the partners who would take the next step to issue the contracts. LSU's foundation raised their hand. Rob Stewart, Patrick Martin, that team said, yes, we will do it. There's a project management committee that we still stay engaged on. The city still stays engaged on. But the work you're seeing out there is under the LSU Foundation's Facility Corporation. We created a University Lakes LLC. That's who's doing the work, and I thank them. That's been a seamless pass off to them. They've done a remarkable job, and they will continue throughout the process. So the money is there. If you ride by there today, you'll see the dredges. They're doing the work. It's ugly. It will be ugly. I told the residents it will smell. You're going to go through something that's not pleasant, but it will be better in the end. And thank you for your attention. We appreciate it.